Yesterday was a sad day for comic fans all over the world. Stan Lee, one of the founders of Marvel Comics, passed away at 95 years old. And with the death of Stan Lee, the comic book industry didn't just lose one of its icons, the comic book medium lost a legend. Stan Lee's contributions to the comic book medium will be remembered for generations because Stan Lee was there in the comic book industry from its inception in the Golden Age through the dark days of the 1950s, and he made one of the most significant contributions to the comic book medium when he ushered in the Marvel Age of Comics with Fantastic Four #1. And with the creation of Fantastic Four #1, Stan laid the foundation for the creation of the Marvel Universe, a world of heroes that kids of all ages know for generations and generations to come. And in that universe of heroes, we got to know ordinary people who were placed in extraordinary situations, who learned how to overcome adversity and the challenges put in front of them. And what was great about Marvel Comics was that, unlike DC Comics, which was a world of ideals, it was a real world of heroes that we saw outside of our window. And in that world of heroes outside of our window, we got to know people who were just like us. The Fantastic Four were just like an all American family. Spider Man was an all American teenager. Thor was the god who walked among us. And Iron Man was the rich man who was disconnected from the world but reconnected once he had this great tragedy befall him in Vietnam. The X-Men were the heroes who were dealing with the issues of race and racism, and Daredevil was the blind man who learned not to be afraid of the world around him. And the Incredible Hulk was the man who was humbled by the monster he became. And these heroes of the Marvel Age of Comics taught us valuable lessons about life in the pages of the comic books Stan wrote and were drawn by the Jack King Kirby. And that was what laid the foundation again for the Marvel Age of Comics, an era of comics that literally changed the way we saw comic books and superheroes all across the world. Stan Lee's creation of the Marvel Age of Comics literally changed the way we saw superheroes and the way we saw comic books as a medium. Now, before the Marvel Age of Comics, we were in a dark period of the 1950s, and thanks to Dr. Frederick Wortham's seduction of the innocent and the congressional hearings regarding comic books, comics were in a very dark place. There were next to no superhero comics out here due to many companies winding up having to go out of business due to the congressional hearings and seduction of the innocent. But Stan managed to keep the industry going in that dark period with horror comics and teen comics like Patsy Walker. And those contributions managed to keep the industry afloat until Stan created Fantastic Four #1 and ushered in the Marvel Age of Comics, an age that literally, again, redefined the comic book medium and literally changed pop culture in America. Because after the creation of the Marvel Age of Comics and the Marvel Universe, we went from seeing superheroes as something that was seen as something bad to something that was literally a part of American culture. And you not only saw the heroes of the Marvel Universe featured in Marvel Comics, but you saw them in TV shows like Hanna-Barbera's Fantastic Four cartoon in the late 60s. the Fantastic Four cartoon of the 70s, Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, the Spider-Man show of the 60s, and cartoons like the X-Men show of the 1990s and the Marvel Action Hour, which featured Fantastic Four and Iron Man. And let me not forget the Marvel superheroes cartoons, which featured many of the characters like Thor, Iron Man, Captain America, and had many iconic theme songs in those still framed cartoons. And as the decades passed by, we went from seeing these characters in animated form until we started seeing them as live action films. And that was one of the things that I think was one of the great blessings that Stan Lee was able to receive from God, was to see the characters he created not only come to life in animation, but then literally evolve and come to life on the silver screen. And it was a great blessing, I believe, from God for him to see the Marvel Universe he created go from images on paper in comic books to animated images to live action movies, and now we literally are living in an age where we can see Marvel comics come to life on screen. I believe that is a great blessing that Stan Lee was able to have, because many comic creators don't get that opportunity to see their characters come to life in an adaptation of a medium once in their lifetime, and Stan got to see it transpire multiple times over his lifetime. That's a great blessing that God gave Stan Lee, that he saw his heroes come to life in many forms of media and many forms of merchandising, from the plastic statues of the 1960s to the Mego action figures to Secret Wars and the 5-inch figures of the 1990s, all the way up to the 6-inch figures of Marvel Legends, which many consider to be the definitive versions of many of Stan Lee's creations in action figure format. So Stan's legacy is all throughout our culture, all throughout our media, all throughout our merchandise, and it's all in the hands of kids all over this world. And one of the great things that when I think of Stan Lee, is not just about comic books and his contribution to comic books, but I also think about his contribution to education. Because if it wasn't for Stan Lee creating those comics back in the early 1960s, many children would not have the gateway to reading. Now, it was Marvel Comics that was my gateway to reading at 4 years old, and I learned how to read from the Marvel Comics that were a part of my brother's comic book collection. And at 4 years old, I practically knew who almost all the Avengers were, thanks to those comics in that collection, because as a boy, I learned how to read from the pictures in Marvel Comics. And it was those pictures in those Marvel Comics that gave me the motivation to learn how to read and to continue learning how to read different types of stories and explore those different and fantastic worlds featured in those Marvel Comics. And as I grew older, I wanted to draw comic books, and it was that passion for wanting to draw comics that led to me becoming a writer. Now, I didn't know how to draw as well as the comic artist who drew Marvel Comics, but because I didn't know how to draw, I thought to myself, I could make the pictures with words. And as I started learning how to make pictures with words, that is what led to me learning how to write my first stories at 9 years old. So comics had a significant impact on me at a young age, and it was one of the things that made me want to be a writer as young as 9 years old. And over the years, it was one of my lifelong dreams to work at Marvel Comics and give back to the comic book medium that Stan Lee was a part of, the comic book medium that taught me how to read and taught me how to write and inspired me how to write by writing those comics and being able to pass on the medium of comics to the next generation of kids. Because if it wasn't for great men like Stan Lee going out here to make those Marvel comics, many of us would not be able to read today, or be out here, going out here to create the great things like comic books or novels or screenplays or movies that we are doing right now. Because if it wasn't for those comics, we wouldn't have had our imaginations opened up to see the world outside of our window and see what we could contribute to the world outside of our window from the fantastic stories that Stan Lee created with the help of artists like Jack Kirby and many others who worked in the early days of Marvel Comics and took the comic book industry from the dark period of the 1950s into the Marvel age of comics, which made comic books a part of American pop culture. And as it relates to the passing of Stan Lee, I am deeply saddened to see this legendary comic creator pass, and it's sad for me to see that he is no longer with us. But when I think about his life, and I think about it a lot after hearing about his passing, um, I just think that God blessed him tremendously because he got to see his characters come to life in multiple forms of media. He got a chance to see his creations be published and shared with readers all over the world. And he got a chance to change the lives of people all around him. That's a great blessing that Stan got from working on all those great comics, and he changed the lives of millions of kids all over the world. And that's something I believe that's going to be his legacy, not only for my generation, but I believe it's going to be for generations to come. And that's a great legacy to have. And it was, again, a great blessing for him to be able to get his comics to the world and share them with the world, because that's what every writer wants to do. Is when they write a story, they want to share it with the world, and they want it to be something that everyone enjoys. And I think of many of Stan's stories, and they are going to be literally like mythology, because when I think of the story of Spider-Man, that literally is a part of not only comic book history, but it's a part of American history, because it's a story that everyone can relate to. It's a story that everybody knows, and it's a story that everybody passes down from generation to generation, because the lesson in that story is one that everyone can learn from. So when I think of Stan Lee, he's a guy who not only created a Marvel age and a Marvel universe, he created a rich modern mythology in the 20th century, a rich tapestry of characters that showed us, again, the world around us, and showed us a world that we could contribute to, because all of the stories in the Marvel universe weren't about superheroes. They were about people, everyday people, being heroes in their own communities and serving those communities with the powers that they had, not just superpowers, but the power to take responsibility for the community and help out those who needed protection from those who would harm them. And that's what I believe we got from all of Stan Lee's comics. Was we just didn't get an ideal of being a hero, we got the real about being a hero, and that all of us could be heroes like the heroes in Marvel Comics, and we could all contribute to making the quality of life of all the people around us better. I got inspired from the Marvel Comics Stan Lee wrote, and that was one of the things that led to me, again, aspiring to be a comic book writer. And because I couldn't do, again, comics due to the issues in the industry, I went into novels and I became a novelist, and everything that I write was, again, inspired by comic books. And it was those comics that, again, led to me wanting to be that great writer. And I hope one day to be able to build on the legacy of men like Stan Lee and the late, great Dwayne McDuffie and go out here and be able to create stories that inspire others to do their best, be their best, and go out here and tell great stories that can be shared for generations to come. When I think of Stan Lee again, if I were ever able to say one thing about him, it would be able to say thank you, because if it wasn't for Stan, I would not be reading and writing right now. And all I can say is thank you for all the great comics, and thank you for all the great contributions you made to the comic book medium, because if it wasn't for those great comics and those great stories, I would not have learned how to read, and I would not be the writer I am today.